Well, Evan, thank you very much for being a part of the program today. I know you got to be busy. A lot of talk was created by your debut of the Dark Side of the Ring Season 3, Part 2 this past week, but thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. Quite the response to the episode.
And, you know, you've done so many episodes now over we're in Season 3, the second half of it, that have gotten a lot of attention, have been tragic stories or have been, you know, with the Brian Pillman episode, especially, there was some element of redemption at the end with Brian Jr. and the family starting to reconcile with, you know, you've had the tragic tales of the Benoit episode, et cetera, and they've gotten a lot of attention. But I don't know that any of the dark sides of the ring have had so many self-inflicted wounds from the participants that almost nobody in the episode came off doing themselves any favors, either at the time of the incident in 2002 or in some of their recollections of it after the fact than this one. And how did you guys decide on this being one of the topics this season?
Well, the plane ride from hell, as it's been referred to over the years, has been a subject that has been suggested to us on repeat for years and years. Even I think in the very original pitch deck for the show, when we originally pitched the show to Vice, it had a little, section on the plane ride from hell. And I think that's mostly just because it is such an infamous story and it's been around for so long. And I think one of the reasons that we hadn't tackled it in previous seasons was, based upon our cursory knowledge of just the events themselves, it sort of seemed to not really be a fit for the type of storytelling that we normally do, in terms of, the human stories, the family stories, or the tragic stories in that regard. And at the time, it sort of appeared on the surface level, and maybe that's just because of the way it's been portrayed for so many years, as a sort of wacky hijinks, boys will be boys, sort of tale, kind of a rock and roll, tale on the road, if you will. And that to us was like, we had a difficult time being like, well, is this a fit for the show? Is it an hour-long story? What are those elements, and how is it really truly, going to fit? And that's like what we thought, for years about the story. And then I think once we got around to season 3, so we had all the episodes under our belt from the first 2 seasons. And we always ask, the viewers of the show on social media or anywhere else, what stories do you want our show to cover? And, historically, we've done pretty good at, tackling the stories that people want to have told. Right. Season 2, Benoit and Owen were by far the top 2 stories people wanted us to cover. So going into season 3, with all the other stories behind us, this one was by far and away the number one story that the audiences wanted us to look into, and that really forced us.
As we've mentioned in the past, in the season 1 especially, you didn't have a track record. People didn't understand what the show looked like, what it was about, and you wanted to concentrate on at least names that would attract people's attention, so they would want to see that story. And now you're able to flesh things out where you don't have to hang your hat, as they say, on a famous name. It's more of the story behind the topic. Yeah. And, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the segment of fans that has wanted to hear about this or hear more about it, or just the memory of it, has been very vociferous since it happened. They can't, for those people who like that kind of thing, that's the kind of thing those people like, they can't get enough of it.
Exactly. And for us, it was like, the overwhelming request for this episode was hard to deny. And I'll even admit too that a lot of people, just friends and fellow wrestling fans that would come to me, it's like, when are you doing Plane Ride from Hell? When is Plane Ride from Hell going to be a story? That was always constantly suggested. So when we started season 3 and we had 14 episodes to decide upon, it was like hard to not at least look into the story some more. And when we started to do that, we really, I think for the first time, saw that, how prescient the story really is. And especially in light of the fact that, like what I was saying earlier, how it had been portrayed previously. I mean, you've seen animated cartoons, that have depicted events on this flight or forms of these events in previous, out there. And so I thought, going into this story and telling it, it would be interesting to really get sort of the oral history behind it, to get different viewpoints, because it is something that is so, stories like this are something so prescient in our culture today. And our show, I think, really touches on those cultural significant moments in wrestling. In addition to the more tragic stuff, we do look at the stories that really made a major impact in the business, or when the business really changed. It's a totally different story, but the Montreal Screwjob, for example, is a story that, we did in season 1, with you. And that was a time when the business really shifted. That was a time when the backstage, storyline kind of became more interesting than perhaps what was happening in the ring. And that's when fans started to get really interested, on a larger scale to what was happening, behind the scenes. And, for this, it's such an interesting, significant moment in wrestling, especially in the WWE, because one fact that kind of blew my mind as we did look into it is that this overlaps almost to the day to when WWF would change to WWE. And I think that's a very significant metaphor, because, we're now looking at a time in the WWE when it's really shifting norms, and how are we addressing, these types of behaviors and things that were happening prior in previous generations,
Well, and that's after this flight, they had to tell several of the wrestlers to get the F out.
Right.
Right. And that's the thing. And I've told earlier in the program, before we brought you on, I've told some stories of times that I was on airplanes, both private and commercial, with wrestlers, some of the same people involved in these stories, and that you never saw shit like this go on, especially all at the same time. I mean, yeah, this was like a highlight film, maybe a low light film, of every goofy activity that you ever hear about going on with the boys in a bar, in a locker room, in a hotel somewhere. But it was all in the same place at the same time. Normally, some guy gets his ponytail cut off while he's asleep. That story would last for 6 months or a year, and that would be the big thing that happened. Or the guy gets punched and gets busted open. Or the people are getting drunk and going crazy. The wrestling match between Hennig and Brock Lesnar. Everybody's heard the stories from the 70s in the AWA when Mad Dog Vachon got drunk and tried to open the emergency exit of the AWA private plane, right?
Right.
Those things would. But Don Fargo, one time, when he and Ray Stevens were brothers, partners, Ray and Don Stevens. Fucking Stevens said he shot him in the leg with a .22, but it was just a flesh wound. But it was just you would still, even in the old days of wrestling, never see constant, prolonged behavior with this many people involved in it in the same place at the same time. It was ridiculous. And to be honest, part of that, as I've said, and I still say, is because the boys in the 80s were crazy in their own environment. But when they did get a private plane, they considered themselves lucky because they'd been driving a fucking beat up Ford before, right? And they tried not to fuck that up. And even in the 90s, I didn't want to be on a commercial plane with most of the guys in the WWF, because it saved the guys. At least in the locker room in the WWF, a lot of the guys were more childish in the 90s than they ever were in the 80s, because they were a little bit more privileged, making a little bit more money, and being catered to more as celebrities and stars. Mm-hmm. And I think in the 2000s, that was just completely exacerbated. You've got a chartered, what was it, 747 or 757?
757.
Okay, you've got a chartered 750. In the 80s, Ric Flair was flying on a Gulfstream, a G1, former prop jet what's a goddamn commuter airline plane from the 60s that Crockett had bought secondhand, and everybody was drinking beer out of a cooler, and we're all glad to get home that night. But then 20 years later, these guys are being given chartered 757s with full bars, with complete flight crews, and making a fortune, and being flown back and forth across the ocean from Europe, and they're acting like they're the Rolling fucking Stones. It got worse when the guys started making more money and being treated more like stars. Their natural inclinations, which made them charming, all those crazy wrestlers, just goddamn, it was like, you gave Bret Michaels steroids and fucking told him, now go be a rock star. What the fuck? That's, to me, it's not only about the norms changing from what was acceptable in the 80s to what was acceptable in the 2000s, but it was also the guys' behavior being ramped up by feeling a sense of, we're untouchable. We're big fucking stars. And even the same guys weren't acting that way 10 and 20 years beforehand. Anyway, that's and I think that of all the episodes you guys have done, everybody in the wrestling business practically came off shittier in this one than any of the others. And it's their own fault because of their own behavior. And that's why I didn't want to be on a flight with guys in the WWF anyway, because they were ribbers, and me on a fucking plane. And if I was Xanax, somebody woke me up, I'd have probably gone to fucking prison for goddamn flipping out and diving out the window. Here's one situation that's come up since the show aired. Jim Ross and Terry Runnels both remember Vince McMahon being on the plane.
Right.
Reports have come out since that they had conflated that with another Europe. Apparently, there were 3 flights from Europe where there were incidents enough to remember and conflate with something like this, which is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
But now the point is, you guys are trying to investigate further and figure out whether they misspoke or whether Vince was really on the plane.
Yeah, well, just first on the first bit there about the various plane rides from hell. I mean, that's something that we faced a lot in researching the story and doing the interviews, is that there were a lot of conflating kind of between the different flights. And even like, when fans or viewers of the show, the other night were watching it too, a lot of people were responding to certain things like, how come this wasn't in there, that wasn't in there? And I think that was largely because it's just like there's a number of these infamous flights. Or sometimes we would talk to some of the boys, on the show, or some of the people we interviewed, and it would be like, well, which one, or this is just the one that got out. There's dozens of these crazy flights that we've been on. So not sure what that says, but regarding Vince McMahon being on the flight, when I saw, some people sharing the other day who were on the flight, I think Jonathan Coachman had mentioned something that he was on the flight and said that Vince was not there. One interesting thing is I was sort of looking back at the interviews that we did, and I think I know every single person we interviewed: Tommy Dreamer, Heidi, Justin Credible, Mike Chioda, Terry Runnels, Rob Van Dam, all said he was
a reference to Vince on the plane.
A reference to Vince being on the plane. And so, in terms of when you're doing these stories, sometimes when we do get conflicting information, which happens a lot. I mean, I know from our very first episode, when we did the Bruiser Brody story, I mean, you rate in that episode, you hear 2 different people, Tony Atlas, Abdullah the Butcher, fighting over the narrative. And, that's always been something we've been conscious of in making the show. And everyone we talked to, there wasn't any disparity in that or dispute of if he was on the plane or not. So I think from our perspective, we just it just wasn't even a thing to consider. But now, of course, it's interesting after the fact when you hear from other people who, were on the flight that he wasn't there. So, yeah, I mean, that's, again, and memory is subjective. And sometimes when you're doing these interviews and, I think it's part of the reason. You look back.
It didn't affect what happened. It just, in some people's minds, viewers, they would have said, well, why didn't Vince do something? And of course, because I've been on planes where Vince was sitting next to Jim Ross and told him, JR, go and do it. So Vince has, on an airplane, told JR to go do something with somebody multiple times throughout his life. But the point is, a lot of the viewers may have thought, well, Vince could have stood up. But at the same time, and I know poor beleaguered JR, he was having to sit there and suffer through all that shit. But I felt like even some of those people, when I have been, this was after I had come back to Louisville and gotten my cocoon, so I wasn't around them then. But a lot of those people, all it would have been was for some person in authority to say, gentlemen, if you don't sit down and do the best you can to go to sleep instead of causing a stir or trouble, then please just leave your name here with Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations or whatever, so we can make the appropriate adjustments to our talent roster when we land back in the States.
Right.
But again, you don't want a plane full of pissed off wrestlers, but I would have thought maybe shouldn't there have been a federal requirement? Well, they were overseas about only one giant fully stocked liquor cart to a plane, for fuck's sake, especially if they're going to sit on the ground for 7 hours before an 8-hour flight. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the issues that came out of the program was comments that Tommy Dreamer made. And I've got to admit that I can't not laugh at I don't know what his intention was. And I think maybe in somewhere in there, he was trying to paint Ric Flair in a better light or whatever, but he just came off like an asshole because he was openly, it seemed, hostile to the poor flight attendant, Heidi, who came off like the nicest human being that you had ever met in your life. And the juxtaposition of her comments and his comments just made him look like the biggest uncircumcised dick on the planet. And Dreamer's not that big of a dick, but he obviously had, it seemed like something was sticking in his craw about this. I don't know. Maybe he's one of the people that she didn't get to because he was in the back row with the service card or something. But I understand someone trying to take up for a friend, paint somebody in a better light when they fucked up or whatever. But I think that your poor Tommy shot himself not even in the foot, but straight up between the eyes with the way that he was hostile toward her and the whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things, that came to light out of covering the story in terms of doing all the interviews that we did was just that, everyone had this. I mean, this is a very sensitive topic. It's a very sensitive, like I said before, prescient, in many ways and relevant to today. And everyone, I think out of a lot of the episodes that we've done previously, it was just one of the more uncomfortable, it was a very uncomfortable, or a lot of the interviews were uncomfortable. And I think that, but to us, it was, wanting to represent the different viewpoints of those who were interviewed. And, and to sort of build the oral history of it, not only when it happened in 2002, but, in terms of how it's viewed today. Those were the comments he wanted to share about, the incident. And so, yeah. But I think that, oh, sorry. Well,
no, go ahead, finish.
Well, I was just going to say too that, out of the response out of the show, on Thursday night into Friday, I think one of the things that, was really, at least eye-opening, I think, to a lot of people is obviously a lot, there's going to be a subset of people who are going to pick apart facts, or they're going to, react to he said and she said, and things of that nature. But the thing to me that I'm glad that there was a subset of the audience that really picked up on it, because it was one of the things to me that became kind of eye-opening about the story more broadly, which is Terry Runnels when she talks about the nature of don't sell it, the idea of quote unquote don't sell it, and one thing that
just so you know, that's not a new thing either, because the first thing that I heard when I got into business was when they fuck with you, don't sell it.
Right.
It wasn't a boy, girl, male, female thing. It was just a fucking guys. Everybody in the business is going to fuck with you. Don't sell it. You're not supposed to sell it.
Sure. And in the context of wrestling and, being in the business, yes. But The one thing I just want to say about that is, one thing that is fascinating about the stories we cover in our show, and I think it's a big part of why we choose certain stories, is the idea of, wrestling historically has always mirrored culture. And vice versa. It's like a hall of mirrors, it always happens. And I think for those that really latched on to the don't sell it part of the story the other night is, to me, that's so universal to somebody, and ubiquitous to a woman watching that show who, may not be, caught up into, the wrestling or anything like that, but that is something that is it's pervasive in our culture, and it's something that I think that is a tangible, understandable, and heartbreaking thing, but that is something I think people took away from it, and that was to me, I think, just because we do make so many parallels between the business and the storylines into our own daily lives, and for a lot of the people who watch the episode who aren't necessarily caught up in wrestling or in the storylines, to have connected with that, was something that for me out of all of this, was really eye-opening.
Well, and of course, past the haircuts and Hayes punching Bradshaw and busting him open and him slapping him and knocking him out and shaving cream and H-bombs and Brock and Hennig almost breaking through the fuselage. Apparently the star of our show, and I hate to say it, was Ric Flair. And everybody knows how I feel about Flair. I love Ric Flair. I was a fan of his as a wrestler. I was a fan of his after I got in the business because he was the best. He has done so much for me personally, getting me the first booking spot, putting the word into, for me and the midnight to be hired by Jim Crockett. I've worked with him always, never had an issue, blah, blah, blah. But I can't be one to persecute him or call for his, launch into space, but there's no way you can defend it in that environment at that time. It was wrong. It was way, way past wrong. But I'm not going to say what Tommy Dreamer was trying to say, but I don't know what he was trying to say. But I think in there somewhere, if these words had just come out, that not defending the behavior, not defending what he did, not saying it was okay, but just to, instead of defend it or lighten it up, try to explain it or give context to it, and then what in the world was this guy thinking? I guarantee you that Ric Flair had not even an idea, but a thought in his head that he was offending this woman when he did what he did. That's what I can tell you. Because the problem, we've seen this in the specials and the documentaries on Rick, and I hate it every time one of these things comes out, is that, but I mean, he's been open the 30 for 30 and everything. Rick never, I don't want to say never grew up. He was a grown man, but Rick never grew out of being the nature boy of the 70s and 80s. And part of it was, I'm not telling on him, substances, drinking, basically. And part of it was, I mean, he's the one that said I used to, I'd have sex 2 or 3 times a day, jack off twice and whatever. I mean, I don't know what the fuck, but that worked for Ric Flair when he was Nature Boy Ric Flair, the NWA World Champion in the 70s and 80s. And he was completely ensconced in the wrestling world. And the outside world did not know of this, nor did they care, nor did he, go out in the outside world. It was going to the towns, going to the hotels, going to the bars, and doing it over again the next day. And the only audiences that he had for these things were receptive ones, because it was in the business. It was either the boys in the locker room or the boys at the hotel or the girls at the hotel that were there because the boys were at the hotel. And I've said, when I was on the booking committee with Rick, me and him and Kevin Sullivan, we flew somewhere. It was a TV taping. And we went to his room at the hotel because we had to go over formats and either we were working on TV or fed, whatever the case may be. But of course, he'd been talking to the flight attendants. And of course, he said, the Marriott girls, and the phone rings, and the flight attendants off the flight have found their own transportation to come to the hotel, to call the room, to get him to let him come up so they could see the helicopter. And me and Kevin are sitting in the corner trying to figure out the times of the finishes on TV while he's showing the girls the helicopter. They're having a wonderful time. That was when that's somebody's life for so long, they don't realize when shit changes and they get 25 years older and they're out of that bubble. And now it's not the girls in Greenville and and Crockett's Gulfstream and, or a flight to Japan where in the 80s, everybody knew who Flair was. If when he walked on a plane, you knew he was somebody, even if you didn't know who he was. And somebody on a plane knew who he was. And going to Japan and shit, I never saw him do the fucking robe thing, but I've heard the stories because that's what he'd do on an 18-hour flight. That was before 9/11. That was when he was in his early 30s. That's when people felt differently. But the problem is not only did times and things change, but the environment changed also. And because I've found out just by telling jokes, just because you've done something and nobody ever said a word about it before, and everybody laughed, doesn't mean they're going to 25 years later. Mm. And like I said, I never saw him I'll tell you one thing though. We're in Washington, D.C. one night. And we're at the Howard Johnson's, right? Because it was cheap at the airport. Me and the Midnight Express and some of the other guys. Flair, of course, was at the Marriott. Where it's January, there's a foot of snow on the ground. I didn't see this, but the story went around the next day when we left and headed back home. Flair in his robe, belt, and nothing else, and his girl in a fur coat and nothing else, trudged a half mile down the hill from the Marriott to the Howard Johnson's in the snow just so that he could go knock on the boys' doors. And they'd open the door and both him and his girl would flash the guys and they'd all laugh and then he went back. But when you go, that was normal behavior in the wrestling business and with the boys and for the boys and with the girls around, and nobody complained and everybody was happy about it and nobody cared because that's what everybody was there for. But then all of a sudden, being in Greenville, South Carolina every Monday night became you go to Chicago twice a year. And the people at the hotels and at the bars weren't there because the wrestlers were there. They were there because, goddamn it, they happened to be at a bar staying at a hotel. And it ain't the same audience. And they're not receptive. But nobody bothered to explain it to Rick and a lot of these other guys. And I think that therein, I can't excuse any of Rick's behavior. And I can't excuse any of the other shit that went on that plane. That's why I don't want to be around wrestlers on planes. I don't want to be on a plane to begin with. But can I say, legitimately telling the truth, that do I think that Ric Flair actually ever believed, until probably he got sued for this or whatever, that he had offended anybody? He would probably be gobsmacked if you said, Rick, they're going to fucking sue you. What? It didn't compute with a lot of the guys. And this is 20 years ago now, and some of them haven't got out of it yet. So anyway, that's my comment on that. But it's been an interesting episode, or it was an interesting episode. It's been some interesting fallout.
Just real quick, I think too, like, out of this too, to go back to JR for a second, and when and I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but talking about, how this new generation, came in to the business around that time, and that shift, and how a lot of up and coming wrestlers, borrowed what they were, borrowed some of the right things and some of the wrong things from the previous generation. And I think that is a key thing, in our episode that we wanted to highlight, and that JR did highlight. I mean, that's what really came through in his interview. Is that changing tide with, what was happening in the industry at that time in the context of this story.
You know what? Now they encourage the guys and the girls in the locker room to mess around with each other so that the guys don't mess around with the girls on the road, the fan girls on the road, the female fans on the roads, what I'm trying to say, which is a 180-degree opposite from what you didn't want love stories going on in the locker room in the old days, because when the inevitable breakup came, then that would disrupt business. And there was plenty of girls at the matches that, that's what they came for. Now, that's the exact opposite, as I said, of 40 years ago. In the middle, 20 years ago, because that's one other thing I'm going to bring up, and I can't remember who made this comment, but was it Rob Van Dam, who said that the guys used to H-bomb girls at bars, drop the Halcyon, which is a tranquilizer, in somebody's drink, and boom, and they're, they're in limbo. That's what I'm talking about with those guys. They heard what the boys used to do back in the old days when the wrestlers, the boys. No, they didn't do that back then, because you didn't need to knock the girl out. That's why she came to the matches. If she was there with you, that's what she came for. So they are trying to imitate that by going out and finding innocent fucking victims at the hotel bar and doing what they think qualified them to be in the wrestling business. And thankfully, most of the guys have cleaned up from that, but there was a weird curve in the middle of the wrestling business about 20 years ago where the wrestling bubble popped and you couldn't live in it anymore with just the fans in the building and the car and the road, and do it all over again the next day. And a lot of guys were going out trying to be celebrities and rock stars like they heard the wrestlers are supposed to be, but they didn't have their own environment to do it anymore. And that's why a lot of this shit, like I said, I was in the locker rooms, I was on planes in the 80s. I didn't see behavior like that, and you don't see behavior like that again today. So it was this, everybody made a lot of money. It was being treated like celebrities and rock stars, but at the same time, they'd been let loose in the real world because they didn't have a wrestling bubble anymore. And nobody knew how to fucking act. Anyway.
Oh, yeah.